must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned.
In this video, we're going to talk about the folk revival. That should sound strange because we haven't talked about folk music. So why are we talking about something's revival when we haven't even talked about the thing itself? Well, just in the way that this story is kind of unraveling and the way that I think it's best to tell it, it didn't make sense to take a tangent in the very first week and talk about folk, something that we weren't even going to really get into very deeply, and then return back to our main story. So I think it actually just makes a little bit more sense to talk about both the origins of folk and the folk revival all at this point in the story. So folk music, it just comes from the word for people. Folk is people, so it's just the music of the people. And this is often used compared to classical music. So if you talk about historical music in Europe, for example, we have folk music and we have basically church music. So another way to think about this might be secular music. But it's just music of the people. So this emerged in the late 50s and early 60s as a revival. And this is one of the first splits in the youth market. So rock and roll at this point was just one facet of pop music. When Elvis Presley came on the scene, rock and roll dominated the pop charts. It was the absolute most popular genre. But after the Payola scandal, once we get to this golden age of rock, when the record labels, when the major labels kind of took over the genre, we finally do see a split where the younger kids still tend to, like teenagers, still tend to enjoy rock and roll, the version that was being produced by the major labels. But the people who were children when rock and roll first hit are in their 20s now, and they're tending to prefer this folk music. And again, so late teenagers, college-aged listeners, what would happen is these college students would try to impress people by the fact that they listened to folk music. It would show how serious they were. They would also listen to jazz and classical, and they would do things like grow a beard and stroke their beard, and they'd put on a sweater. Maybe they'd start smoking a pipe or something, and they would reflect on these very serious issues. And an opportunity to listen to folk music in front of people showed everyone else how serious they were, just talking about folk as being their favorite genre. The irony, though, is that folk music is just as commercial as every other genre. Only the image isn't. It's still produced by the same record labels. They're still the same producers. A lot of the time it's the same studio musicians. All those details are the same, but we have this image of seriousness, and there's something different about it. And again, that's the folk revival. That's not the original folk music, which we're going to talk about in a moment, but that's this revived version. By the time we get to the late 60s, protest music of the civil rights movement, things like that, folk music takes yet another turn. So we kind of think of folk music as having three sections. And I know it seems confusing, but we're talking about the middle section first. We're sort of taking the Star Wars approach. We're doing 4, 5, and 6. And now that we've talked about that, let's go back and talk about 1, 2, and 3. Let's talk about the origins of folk, the first time it came onto the scene, which was in the 1940s. So you've probably actually heard a lot of these famous songs from the folk music of this time period. Probably the most important figure is a man by the name of Woody Guthrie. And I think his most famous song is probably This Land Is Your Land. Now, if you listen to the song, a lot of people as children sing this about America, sharing it and everyone getting along, everyone being friends, things like that. And the first verse certainly does sound like that. But you have to listen to the entire song. You have to listen to all the verses that are usually left out of the elementary school version, where it's actually quite critical of America. And it's not anti-American, but it's holding America to a very high standard and being critical of the way we're doing things. So I want you to listen to the entire song of This Land Is Your Land, and I would love to hear your thoughts on all the verses after the first verse. Woody Guthrie is famous for having the words on his guitar, "This machine kills fascists." Now, that leads to a lot of really interesting discussion about what does he mean by that, because we don't really get a great account of what it means to him. But if we think about fascism, I think we all know what fascism is. Most popular example would be the Nazi regime of the 1930s and 40s under Adolf Hitler, where it's absolute control, absolute government control, tyranny, corruption, no regard for human life, no regard for human decency. It's all about power, usually tied in with nationalism, white supremacy, or some other kind of supremacy, putting down other people. So when he says this machine, he's probably referring to the guitar or music or the power of song, something a bit abstract like that. And the power of his instrument and the power of his ability as a songwriter and as a performer and the platform he has as a songwriter and performer to get his music out, that gives him the power. It gives the people the power to rise up against people who would make America into a fascist country under a dictatorship. And it's the people who have the ability to stop something like that if they speak their mind, if they speak up. And way back in the 1940s, when this was going on, when the Nazi movement was still happening, that was his big message. This machine kills fascists. You'll see that all over the place. You'll see other popular musicians have that written on their guitar. You'll see a lot of people put stickers that say that on their laptops or on the bumper sticker or rear window of their car, but that's where it comes from. This machine kills fascists. It's from Woody Guthrie, a folk musician. We also have a family group called the Weavers with famous songs like Goodnight Irene from 1950 and On Top of Old Smoky from 1951. We have Pete Seeger, no relation to Bob Seger, with his very famous song called Little Boxes, another one called Which Side Are You On? And the thing about Which Side Are You On is it's really talking about American politics at the time that you have to pick a side. If you don't do anything, you're complicit and you're part of the problem. So you have to stand up, you have to fight, you have to speak up for what you believe in and for what is right. But let's take one step back to Little Boxes. So I really love this song, and I think the original version is excellent. There's a really cool cover from 2012 by a group called Walk Off the Earth, and the music video is all one take, and they're playing instruments that they made themselves for the most part. So it's really cool. I'll definitely post a video for that, and you'll have to check that out. But the point of Little Boxes is the little boxes are... So one thing I want you to think about, I'm going to post some questions, and I want you to actually reflect on the answers. You are in college right now. You are probably, if you fit into the majority of people, planning to one day, after you complete college, you're going to try to get a career. You'll probably try to get married and have kids and get a house and a mortgage payment and all these things that are just expected of the average American. Well, the question that Pete Seeger would ask you is why? Why are you doing that? Do you really want that? Is that what you want? Or is that what you've been conditioned to want? Do you actually, like why are you in college right now? Why aren't you traveling the world? Why aren't you getting a job? What put you here? It's something to think about. And when I've taught this class in person, whenever I pose that question, surprisingly, no one really has a good answer. And sometimes I say, you know what? I actually don't know why I'm here. I guess because my parents told me to go here. And why did they go? Well, probably because their parents did. And we get so stuck in this way of doing things that we think we're just supposed to, and we never really question, why should we do this? Do I want to do this? And of course, there will be plenty of you that have very clear goals in your life and a direction you want to go and something you want to do with your life. You want to make a difference. You want to make the world a better place in some way or form, and college is a necessary stepping stone for you to get to that point. But you should still question it. And again, I'm not saying it's wrong to want any of those. It's not bad to want any of those. But if we were to take some advice from Pete Seeger, we should think about it. We should think about why do we want this and say, is this something that we actually want, or are we just following the herd? So some advice from Pete Seeger, listen to Little Boxes, and then you can reflect on life in those ways. In the folk music of this time period, it's focusing on social problems and sharing in this sense that we should take care of one another. We should care for our community. We should care for our neighbors, both the people who we know and also the people that we don't know. This music is a reaction to McCarthyism. So McCarthyism is named after Senator Joseph McCarthy. This is something called the Red Scare, or the second Red Scare, that happened in the 1940s and 50s, where they would say everyone is a communist. Everyone's a communist or a communist sympathizer. If you didn't agree with them, if you didn't think exactly like they thought, you were a communist, you were a communist sympathizer. And that was really the worst thing you could say about someone at the time. You could be investigated by the government. You could perhaps even do some jail time. And you could be ostracized by your community. The movie Trumbo is all about that, where if you don't subscribe to what everyone else thinks you should, that's a problem, and you're going to be punished for that. And you're going to be forced to get in line. These people thought, no, I'm not going to do that. And they resisted. So that's tying in with the "this machine kills fascists," that mentality of not rebelling, but questioning. Just questioning. There's nothing wrong with questioning and being critical of society. So that's your background. Now let's return back to the folk revival that happened during this time period, the late 50s, early 60s, that is the focus of this week. So we have a few groups. The first one we'll talk about is called the Kingston Trio, and they were fascinated by calypso, like the Banana Boat song. And so it's a variety of kind of Caribbean music. And these were professional performances, but they don't sound like they're professional performances. They were specifically trying to create this simple sound that sounds like any person, any musician, any man or woman with an acoustic guitar could have recorded this after performing in a coffee shop or on a college campus, something like that. They're intentionally trying to get that sound. If you want to hear a great example of this from the Kingston Trio, listen to Tom Dooley from 1959. What's different about this revival of folk music is that edge of the first one that was focused on social issues, political issues. All of that has been removed. So it's definitely a tame, watered down variety of folk music that is radio friendly. And again, it was a reaction to McCarthyism in that McCarthy way of thinking sort of won, and that everyone has been silenced. So these songs, while sounding similar, it sounds like the same genres from that tradition. They've removed that very critical aspect. So you're not going to hear that in these songs. But the Kingston Trio did have 10 singles in the top 40, which is pretty impressive. So it's this anti-establishment music, kind of, but it's built by the establishment, created by the establishment, and succeeding in the establishment. Peter, Paul, and Mary, I think for me personally, they're probably the most important group, or at least the most famous group from this time period. So it's three singers. Their names are Peter, Paul, and Mary. And they were considered the top folk revival act. They formed in Greenwich Village in 1961. Greenwich Village is an area of Manhattan in New York City, downtown Manhattan, sort of, if you've ever been there. 14th Street, going from east to west, is sort of the center of Greenwich Village. But it's this artistic community, very bohemian community. It's been gentrified, so now it's a very expensive community. But a lot of artistic movements are going to come from the Greenwich Village, usually referred to just as the Village. So that's where they come from. They have a few songs. One is from 1962 called If I Had a Hammer. 1962 also Puff the Magic Dragon, probably their most famous song. And then one by Bob Dylan from 1963 called Blowin' in the Wind. So this is the first time we've mentioned Bob Dylan's name, who's going to be a central character in our story. Bob Dylan at this point was not famous as a soloist at all. He was just a songwriter writing music for other people. So he wrote Blown in the Wind that was performed and first made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary. I would argue that when the average music listener thinks about folk music, they think about the late 1960s and social protest songs. They think about Bob Dylan, they think about Joan Baez, people like that. But actually, when we're talking about folk at this part of the story, in the first half of the 60s, it's very mild and it's commercial folk. It's being made for the purposes of selling records, just like every other genre. It still has the sound and the visual look and image of the earlier version of folk and the version that will come, but at this point it's very commercial. Bob Dylan, who is going to become the most important figure in folk, at this point was thought of being as his voice was too amateurish and it wasn't professional and polished enough. Basically, that's a nice way of saying he just didn't have a nice voice. He didn't have a good singing voice, and was thought that he couldn't be successful because of that. So he was just a songwriter at this point, writing for other people. By the time we get to 1963, 1964, folk music is going to be increasingly focused on the civil rights movement. And by the time we get to the late 1960s, it will fully move into that position. One example of that would be that Peter, Paul, and Mary actually opened up for Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. They performed alongside him that day. The focus will turn to first civil rights and then the Vietnam War, but again, that's later in the story. That's it for folk music right now.